Weekend Hustlers, it's Pavlov here.
And Nikita.
We are diving into some fascinating changes happening in global trade.
And you know we love to deep dive on this show, so if you're enjoying it, please hit subscribe.
Yes, 75% of you guys aren't subscribed.
Which is wild.
So please help us out with that.
And if you are subscribed, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
So today we're looking at this report from BCG that came out January 2025.
And they really paint an interesting picture of how global trade is evolving.
Yeah, and this is building on their research that they've been doing since like 2018.
So this is not just a flash-in-the-pan observation.
No, this is serious long-term trend analysis.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that while global trade is still projected to grow,
They're saying it sounds like 2.9% annually over the next decade.
the routes that these goods are taking are set to change dramatically.
So that's what we're going to be unpacking today.
Our goal is to dig into these major shifts and really understand what's driving them and why it matters to you.
Yeah, because whether you're strategizing for your own business or just trying to wrap your head around the global economy
Or just curious.
this deep dive will give you a really clear understanding of these changes without getting bogged down in too many details.
All right, so the report highlights 4 key shifts in global trade corridors.
Yeah.
And the first one that really jumps out is North America solidifying as a more resilient trade bloc.
Right.
And they're really trying to reduce their reliance on Asia and particularly China.
Yeah, so what's interesting here is we're seeing this combination of things happening all at once.
Right.
So you have companies bringing production back to the U.S., that's what we call reshoring.
Reshoring.
Then you have nearshoring, where they're shifting manufacturing to Mexico and Canada.
Closer to home.
And then there's this idea of friendshoring.
Friendshoring. Yeah.
Which is basically prioritizing trade with countries that are seen as, reliable
partners
and aligned, politically.
Mm-hmm.
All of this is really a response to this, desire to lessen dependence on China.
And the projected growth in trade within North America is pretty substantial.
Yeah.
We're talking $315 billion annual increase between the U.S. and Mexico by 2033.
Wow.
And another $147 billion between the U.S. and Canada.
That's a lot of trade.
It is a lot of trade, and a big part of that is because of USMCA.
USMCA.
That's the updated trade agreement between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada.
Right.
And it's designed to, modernize those trade rules and encourage that regional integration.
We're also seeing industrial policies in areas like electric vehicles, batteries, renewable energy that are kind of incentivizing, development of those domestic and regional supply chains.
Yeah, because there's a real push to bring a lot of that manufacturing back.
Absolutely. And Mexico especially has a lot of potential to capitalize on this nearshoring trend.
I was reading that it's not just final assembly that's moving down south.
Oh, really?
But also increasing specialization within supply chains.
So what do you mean by that?
So Mexican firms are developing expertise in specific components for U.S. industries.
Oh, wow. So they're becoming more specialized rather than just assembling the final product.
Exactly.
That's really interesting.
But the report does mention that there's a little bump in the road, potentially.
Oh, no. What's that?
For this North American resilience.
Like?
The USMCA renegotiation is coming up in 2026.
I see.
So that's a big question mark right now.
Yeah, it is.
Because the U.S. has voiced concerns about Chinese companies potentially using Mexico as a way to get around U.S. tariffs on goods like EVs.
Oh, that's sneaky.
So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Well, it seems like it's going to be very delicate because, if the U.S. pushes too hard on those rules of origin, it could make Mexico less attractive.
And even push production further afield.
Yeah, you got it.
So they really have to strike a balance there.
Definitely.
So beyond North America, friendshoring seems to extend to other partners, and specifically the EU. They're forecasting $303 billion increase in U.S.-EU trade by 2033.
Wow, that's a lot.
A lot of growth.
After driving that.
Well, a major factor is the EU's effort to reduce its reliance on Russian energy.
Right.
So that's led to a significant increase in U.S. exports of liquefied natural gas.
LNG.
LNG, that's right. And renewable energy technologies are another key area of that growing trade.
Interesting.
And there's potential for even more growth if both sides work to reduce tariffs and harmonize policies in sectors like automotive and advanced manufacturing.
Makes sense.
But, any rise in protectionist measures on either side of the Atlantic could slow that down.
Right, of course.
So the second big shift the report highlights is China.
Okay.
And they're becoming a stronger trade partner for the rest of the world as their trade with the West slows down.
I mean, that's a huge shift
Huge.
in the global landscape.
Yeah, they're saying that trade between China and what they're calling the West, that's the US, EU, UK, Canada, South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, is projected to decline by an estimated $221 billion annually by 2033.
That's a lot.
But here's the kicker.
What?
Their trade with the global south
Yeah.
is expected to go up $1.25 trillion.
$1.25 trillion.
Trillion.
That's a huge reorientation.
That's enormous.
What's causing that?
Well, a lot of it is China is facing increasing trade barriers and even outright bans on some of their more advanced tech products from those Western countries.
I see.
At the same time, China has been working really hard to deepen its economic ties with these rapidly growing emerging markets in the global south.
Yeah.
So investments through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative,
Right.
coupled with, a stronger commercial engagement, are creating all these new avenues for Chinese companies.
Yeah, it seems like the ASEAN nations are a particularly important part of this whole strategy.
Yeah, the report anticipates that roughly half of that $1.25 trillion increase
Wow.
in China's trade with the global south is going to be with those 10 ASEAN nations.
And the report also points to growing trade within the BRICS plus nations.
BRICS plus.
That's another key element of this.
And just so our listeners know, BRICS is an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
Right.
And the plus just signifies those new member countries.
Okay, cool.
So China's trade with those BRICS plus members and other close partners is expected to account for 44% of its total forecast trade growth over the next decade.
Wow.
And we're also seeing a big increase in that bilateral trade between China and Russia.
Yeah?
Expected to reach $269 billion by 2033.
And that's being driven by a lot of those energy projects.
Yeah, the power of Siberia pipelines.
But even though the volume is increasing with the global south,
Right.
that average value per shipment might actually be lower compared to Western markets.
Right.
So they're going to have to adapt their export strategies.
Right.
Interesting.
But, the report does say that there could be some challenges with this pivot.
Like what?
Well, they mention a potential for pushback against China's growing trade surpluses.
So what does that mean exactly?
Well, the US, EU, India, and others.
Right.
They might consider implementing some measures to address those surpluses,
I see.
which could, create new hurdles for China's continued growth.
Right.
The third major shift is the growing influence of the global south in world trade.
Yeah.
Now, when they say global south,
Yeah.
what are they referring to?
So in this report, they're talking about the 133 developing nations that are members of the United Nations Group of 77, excluding China.
Oh, okay.
So it's a significant bloc.
Right.
Representing a huge portion of the world's population.
And a growing share of the global GDP.
Exactly.
So what's fueling this rise in prominence of the global south?
Well, it's a few things.
Okay.
First, they're forming their own trade alliances and partnerships.
We've talked about BRICS plus, but there's also the African Continental Free Trade Area Mercosur in South America, the Pacific Alliance, and of course ASEAN. Mm-hmm. All these groups are aiming to boost economic cooperation within the South and reduce that reliance on traditional Western markets.
Right. And China's Belt and Road Initiative is also playing a role.
Yeah.
By improving infrastructure and connectivity within the global South.
And the report highlights a big uptick in trade among those global South nations.
Yeah.
And between the South and the North.
Yeah, they're saying that annual trade among those nations is projected to increase by $673 billion.
Over the next decade.
Over the next decade, wow.
And trade between the South and the North is expected to grow by $1.67 trillion.
It's incredible.
And a recent example of that is the free trade agreement between the EU and Mercosur.
It's interesting, though, because it's not just raw materials anymore.
Right.
It's actually more sophisticated manufactured goods.
Yeah, like automobiles, electronics, chemicals, metals, and even fashion.
Wow, so these economies are really becoming more diverse.
Much more mature.
Yeah.
And one region in the global south that seems to be really benefiting from all of this is ASEAN.
Yeah.
The report talks about their growth transition.
So what's happening there?
Well, ASEAN is positioning itself to really be a major winner from these geopolitical shifts.
I see.
With the trade tensions between the U.S. and China, for example.
Yeah.
Many companies are diversifying their supply chains and investing more in ASEAN countries.
Right.
As a result, the combined trade of ASEAN is projected to grow at 3.7% annually.
Over the next decade.
And the trade relationship between ASEAN and China seems to be particularly strong.
Yeah.
They expect trade between those two to grow even faster at 5.6% annually, reaching a projected $558 billion by 2033.
Wow.
So that's huge growth.
Driven by investments and trade agreements.
Right. But the report does mention that there are some potential headwinds for ASEAN.
Yeah, there are those.
Well, they're seeing stagnating trade growth with the EU.
Okay.
And moderating growth with the US.
Why is that?
So the EU's move towards implementing that carbon pricing on imports.
Right.
And their policies to curb deforestation are expected to affect some key ASEAN sectors. And the US might be taking a closer look at goods assembled in ASEAN that contain a large percentage of Chinese-made components.
Because they see that as a way to bypass tariffs.
Exactly.
I see. So to maintain that growth trajectory.
ASEAN needs to focus on developing its own domestic and regional supply chains.
Right.
And invest in upgrading the capabilities of its member nations.
So they can fully participate in this evolving global trade landscape.
Makes sense.
Now, another significant player in the global south is India.
Yes.
And the report calls its trade growth an ignition.
Ignition.
Yeah, so they're pretty optimistic about India.
That sounds promising.
India is projected to see a 6.4% annual growth in its total trade.
Wow.
Reaching an estimated $1.8 trillion annually by 2033.
That's incredible.
That's huge growth, and it's being driven by a lot of things.
What kind of things?
Well, its appeal as a manufacturing base. Government initiatives to boost domestic production.
Okay.
Large and young workforce.
Right.
And rapidly improving infrastructure. And their trade growth is across a variety of partners.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
So they're forecasting a doubling of annual trade, with the U.S. significant increases with the EU, ASEAN, African nations, Japan, Mercosur countries, Australia, South Korea.
Wow.
And even a big surge with Russia.
With Russia.
Yeah. India imports discounted hydrocarbons from Russia.
Oh, interesting.
Now, interestingly, despite this positive outlook, they do see a moderation in India's trade growth with China.
So why is that?
Several factors.
Okay.
India has a growing trade deficit with China,
Yeah.
which is causing some economic concern.
Right.
There's also increasing caution in India about Chinese direct investment.
Particularly in strategic sectors.
Exactly.
And the border dispute probably doesn't help.
Yeah, that's definitely a factor.
So finally, let's talk about the European Union.
The EU.
The report really focuses on their competitiveness in this new environment.
And what are the key takeaways for them?
Well, geopolitical tensions concerned about energy security and this emphasis on values-based trade are really shaping their outlook.
Right.
They're anticipating stagnation in trade with China and a decline in trade with Russia because of the measures that are still in place after the invasion of Ukraine.
But they are still projected to experience overall trade growth.
Yeah, about 2% annually through 2033.
And they anticipate a big increase in trade with the U.S.
Mostly driven by those LNG imports and accelerated growth with partners like India, Turkey, and African nations.
And the potential implementation of that Mercosur trade deal could give them a boost.
Absolutely.
And the report specifically mentions North Africa as a potential region for the EU for nearshoring opportunities and as a source of resources for the green transition.
They see North Africa as a viable location for those supply chains.
Exactly. And the entire African continent is becoming a more critical source for energy and raw materials needed to support their transition
to a greener economy. And trade with India is also projected to grow strongly in sectors like IT, pharmaceuticals, and manufacturing.
So the EU is strategically shifting its focus towards those reliable partners.
And those emerging markets.
Instead of relying on those previous high levels of global trade growth.
Right. Building stronger ties with these new economies and further strengthening their own internal market.
Right.
Will be essential for them to stay competitive.
Okay, so to wrap things up, we've covered a lot.
We have.
What would you say are the key takeaways from this report?
So the main shifts that we've talked about are that increasing resilience of North American trade.
Right.
China's pivot towards the global south. The growing influence of the global south.
Yeah.
ASEAN's growth transition with those hurdles.
Right.
India's trade expansion and the EU's focus on competitiveness.
So global trade is not static.
It's constantly changing.
It's being reshaped by geopolitics and a focus on economic security. And that's leading to some significant changes in the patterns of international commerce.
And understanding these patterns is crucial for navigating the future of global markets.
So here's a final thought for you.
Okay.
With this emphasis on regionalization and these new trade corridors, what could be the long-term implications for a truly globalized economy?
That's a really good question.
Are we looking at a more fragmented landscape of global commerce in the future?
It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
That's for sure.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive on Weekend Hustlers.
We hope you found it valuable.
Until next time.
See ya.